Okay, there we go. All right. Well, um, let's jump right in. Still focusing our attention on the prophetic passage analysis, just as by way of sort of reviewing key steps and looking at when we study a prophetic book. And we've already covered several of these. Prophetic analysis, again, is that first step that we do when we start looking at the passage in particular. And we've already given attention to the read and observing the passage, to then performing the narrative or poetic analysis, depending on what type of genre is used within the particular prophetic passage we're looking at. Then the third thing is to identify the time frame of the specific passage you're looking at. And then what kind of prophetic genre is it? Is it judgment, salvation, apocalyptic? And then we talked about last session, identify what appears to be symbolic language. So we spent some time reviewing that and talking about symbols and how to identify them and how to figure out what they mean. Today, I want to turn our attention to another important step as we examine the prophetic passage, and that is identify or indicate how the passage fits in the author's flow of thought. And we spent some time talking about this when we were discussing the key hermeneutic principles when it comes to studying prophecy. And I think it's important to just quickly remind ourselves about this, that, when you approach any passage of scripture, of course, but this is particularly important for prophetic text, is to remember that text is in a flow of thought. That text is within uh, a book that has passages probably before and after it, and it's connected in some way to those passages, right? And so often what I've observed, and it's tempting to do, is when you see a prophetic passage, especially one that talks about future events, very easy to sort of pull that thing out and try to examine it on its own and pull in other scriptures to try to interpret, when the event is and what's happening in this future event. And so it's very tempting, I think, for us to really isolate that prophetic text from the context, because sometimes I think some people seem to think, oh, this is prophecy, this is a special class, and it's meant to fill in my eschatological view, and so they start bringing in verses from here and there, and their systematic theological grid they put on top of it, and then all of a sudden, this prophecy has a life of its own, and we really have to be careful with that for several reasons that we talked about before. But uh, the key thing to remind ourselves of is that prophetic utterance, that passage, whether it's past, present, or future, that prophetic text is connected directly to the immediate context. And so if it's a prophecy of a future event, in some way, that event is related to the the message of the author, of the prophet, in his present day. And so I think this is one of the best helps to understand the point of the passage, because that's the priority. The priority is not figuring out the details of the event and when it's going to happen. The priority is figuring out, how does this future event support or connect the message of the author to the message of the author. Does that distinction make sense? Um, that's that I think is most important. Again, I think I mentioned this last week, maybe not. I forget what I say where, but um, I think it's helpful in some ways to think of prophecies sort of like parables. in the sense that a parable is a story, right? That Jesus would tell that's related to something in the context, right? Someone said something or something happened or Jesus observed something. And so he would tell a story with a particular point related to that issue, right? So these parables were not meant to be, separated from the text and interpreted in themselves, which a lot of people do, and they come up with these doctrines based on a parable that is not connected to the context. So the way we understand the point of the parable is to understand how it connects to the immediate context. And I see that prophecies in a similar way, that there's a purpose or a message within that prophecy that is in some way connected to what the prophet has been telling his audience. Or there's a purpose in that prophecy for the prophet or the prophet's audience, or both. So it's very important that we don't disconnect the prophecy from the context of the passage. And again, I know nothing new here, but just an important interpretive principle to remember. So as you're going through the prophetic text, just keep asking yourself, okay, I may not understand all the details here, but I want to give attention to how does this prophecy or this prophetic passage connect to what has happened before, what's happened after, or perhaps even to the purpose of the book. Thoughts or remarks or questions about that? I know for us, this isn't a novel, new concept, but it's good to always keep in mind. Tabs, did you have something?
I was just going to ask Pastor if you could give an example of that. Like, where could we find that kind of?
Well, funny you should ask.
Oh.
Actually, I have one.
Okay.
Uh,
Praise the Lord.
there are several, but I wanted to go to one that I think we may have looked at a little bit in class. I know that we talked about it's in Micah 4. I know that we talked about this earlier in our sessions together when we were just looking at talking about this particular principle. And I said at that time I wanted to come back to this passage later. Well, later is now. So I wanted to spend a little time on that together this morning because I find this one of the most fascinating prophetic passages in the prophets. Not so much for what it reveals, though it reveals some pretty significant things, such as the birthplace of the Messiah, right? But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, from you one will go forth from eternity, right? So that's obviously a significant text for the incarnation. But also this passage is an incredibly intricate, complex revelation of future events that really makes no sense at all if you're just looking at it from a future telling point of view. Okay, well let's jump into it. Again, I think you should be somewhat familiar with this as we did talk about it a little bit earlier in our these sessions. Let me pull up passage here. See, tabs, example, Micah 4:5. I can read your minds. I knew you were gonna want this. So, all right. It's helpful to know. Okay, in Micah, what's happened is Micah, right, was written compiling the messages of the prophet Micah. He was focusing particular attention on the injustices, the social abuses, the mistreatment of fellow Israelites, just as an indication of their unfaithfulness to the Mosaic covenant. And so Micah was pointing these issues out, declaring judgment. In chapter 3, he describes judgment upon Jerusalem, even to the point, let me show this, even to the point of declaring that God's going to, for a time, abandon them. Tabs, why don't you start us off? Can you read verses 10 through 12? This is Micah chapter 3.
Okay, Pastor. Micah chapter 3, verses 10 to 12. Who built Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with violent injustice? Her leaders pronounce judgment for a bribe, her priests instruct for a price, and her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, is not the Lord in our midst? Calamity will not come upon us. Therefore, on account of you, Zion will be plowed as a field. You, Zion, will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the temple will become high places of a forest.
All right, so what's God saying here? What's going to happen to Jerusalem?
He's going to judge them by bringing calamity upon them.
Yeah, things don't sound good, do they?
Yeah.
And really, God promising Jerusalem will be judged with violent injustice, really mirroring the injustice that the people had been performing, carrying out against their brothers. But notice here as well, so we see clearly the judgment upon Jerusalem. And then even the question, is Yahweh in our midst? They're going to say, hey, God's with us. No, nothing's going to happen. But actually, at this point in time, God's saying he will essentially abandon them. They will come to ruin. So that's what brings us into chapter 4, where then Micah says, now in the last days, all right, so he's changing direction here in terms of time. So he's saying there will come a time in the future, Jerusalem will be in ruins. Now in the last days, and then he's going to go forward. So Robbie, I'm going to ask you to read first here. If you could, let's say, read verses 1 to 3, and then Renee, if you could read verses 4, or actually, let me ask Ince to read verses 4 to 8. I'll have Renee read in a little bit. So Robbie, go ahead. And as we're reading, guys, just be looking for clues as to time when these events might be taking place.
Okay. And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways and that we may walk in his path. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war.
Verses 4 to 8. Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Though all the peoples walk each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcasts, even those whom I have afflicted. I will make the lame a remnant, and the outcasts a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from now on and forever. As for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it will come, even the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem.
Great. So thank you. Now notice again, and this is what we want to look for, is sort of these time markers that tell us there are transitions, right? We were just reading in chapter 3 about Jerusalem being come in ruins. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, Micah says it will come about in the last days. So say, okay, there's a time shift here. In the last days, which is a key reference that we see in the prophets. I think it's repeated in that day, God says. So in these last days. Now, when are these events taking place here? What do these things sound like? Just from what we know of Scripture, of other passages.
Millennial reign. Sorry.
Yeah, I think so, right? Nation will not lift up sword against nation, right? He's going to judge between the nations, render decisions. So judgments will be completed. There will no longer be war, right? The Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion. Key statement. So we recognize this. This is the Messianic kingdom. And I'll just say far future. All right, unless one of you wants to predict when this is going to be. Anybody want to? Okay, well, that's good because nobody knows. But it's sometime far future. At least we're speaking with reference to Micah, right? Micah prophesied around the late 8th century, like somewhere around 730 to 710 BC, somewhere in there. Okay. So we're talking, 100 years or so before 100 years plus, 100 plus years before the Babylonian exile. Okay. Babylonian exile. And he's speaking to the people of Judah here. Okay, so first he talks about, all right, yes, at some point in the future, you're going to experience, Jerusalem will experience judgment, will be in ruins. But in the last days, the Lord will reign in Mount Zion, and all these things from Zion will go forth the law. All these good things will take place. People will go up to the mountain of the Lord, right? The Temple Mount. So clearly, this is a reference to the Messianic kingdom. That's 1 through 8. All right, now take a look at verse 9. Renee, I'll have you read this one.
Verse 9. Now why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Or has your counselor perished? That agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth, right? And labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth, for now will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies.
Thank you. So what's going on here? Why he just talked about the Messianic kingdom and Messiah reigning from Zion and everything's great. And then he's like, why do you cry loud? Notice the now, by the way. Why do you cry loudly? Is there no king among you? Writhe and labor. Labor like a woman in childbirth. For now you will go out of the city. Well, what? Wait a minute. Hold on a second, Micah. You just said the Lord's going to reign in Zion. I'm gonna make my sword into a plowshare. There's going to be peace. And What are you talking about? Get out of the city and go to Babylon. And then from there you will be rescued. We're rescued. Wait a minute. Didn't you just say everything was going to be great? What's going on here? We've had a change in time, haven't we? What's he talking about here?
This was the judgment that he was referring to earlier.
Probably, yeah.
That they had to go through.
And what specific judgment is that? Do you have any clues here in the text?
Pastor, I think it's the Babylonian exile.
Yes, I think so, right? He mentions Babylon. So this is, I think, most likely the Babylonian exile. And remember, then this would be like 100+ years in the future from Micah's point of view, right? In Micah's day, Babylon wasn't even a world power, by the way. That didn't happen until really, 75, 80 years later. They began to rise to power. And they really weren't a world power until Nebuchadnezzar began dominating the region. So here, I think Micah, and we have the luxury of looking back, right? Obviously, Micah's day, they didn't know, they wouldn't know about Babylon and all of this, but there's clearly a change from verses 1 to 8. Because notice it changes abruptly with that word now, atah. That's a time reference. Okay, so this is a clue that Micah uses when he shifts time. Earlier, he had said, now in the last days, in verse 1. Now, here in verse 9, he says, now. And he says, why do you cry loudly? So he's describing a time here of distress. So we go from chapter 3, where there's a time of distress, Jerusalem will be ruined. Chapter 4, verse 1, in the last days, though, Messiah will reign from Zion. Everything will be wonderful in the land. And then verse 9, he essentially goes back from that time to just the near future from Micah's point of view and describes this time they'll be taken away to Babylon and rescued from there. All right. Then we have verse 11. Harris, I'm going to ask you to read this, verses 11 to 13.
And now many nations have been assembled against you, who say, let her be polluted, and let our eyes gloat over Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, and they do not understand his purpose. For he has gathered them like sheep to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, daughter of Zion, for your horn I will make iron, and your hoofs I will make bronze, that you may pulverize many peoples, that you may devote to the Lord their unjust gain, and their wealth to the Lord of all the earth.
Okay, so notice he says, now, that Hebrew time reference, many nations have assembled against you. Well, wait a minute. Didn't you just say, Micah, that in the last statement, we will be rescued. The Lord will redeem us. But then again, now the nations have assembled against us. Over Zion, again, a reference, I believe, to Jerusalem. But then it describes that they will not be defeated in this case. That the nations will be defeated, that God's going to gather them like sheaves on the threshing floor. So this is some reference to a time when the nations will gather around Jerusalem and God will deliver her. Does that sound familiar to anybody? When is that likely a reference to?
The tribulation, during the tribulation.
Yeah, and at the end of the tribulation, right? The nations gather around Jerusalem. right? Zechariah 14,
Mhm.
Revelation 19. The nations have gathered, and then they are defeated by uh, by Yahweh. So this looks like it's referring to, the beginning to Armageddon, right? The beginning of the Messianic kingdom, or you could say the end of tribulation. All right. So we're again far future, aren't we?
Mm.
Okay. Now here, I'm not trying to show us, how to interpret these verses right now. What I'm just trying to show you is something that Micah is doing. So we are borrowing from our knowledge of other passages that speak of these future events, but we're doing that because I'm trying to make a particular point regarding Micah and what he's doing in reference to time frame. All right. So in chapter 3, he's probably, the days of when Jerusalem's ruined, probably the time of the beginning of Babylonian exile. Chapter 4, then he moves forward to the Messianic kingdom in the beginning. But then verses 9 and 10, he goes back to the Babylonian exile and the time when they're delivered. So the middle and end of the exile. Then in verse 11, he seems to jump forward to Armageddon, the beginning of the Messianic kingdom, when the nations have gathered and God defeats them. All right. Then we get to verse 1 of chapter 5. Robbie, I'll ask you to read this one.
Okay. Now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. With a rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek.
Notice again, now. So he seems to be using that particular word to indicate a time shift. And it sounds like he's speaking of when the verses 11 to 13. So he's saying, that everyone's gathered around Jerusalem. But then notice in verse 11 to 13, he says God's going to defeat them. But then verse 1, he says, muster yourselves, again speaking to the people of Judah, in troops. They've laid siege against us. So hold on a second. Didn't God just take care of them? Is he may be talking about the same event, but notice here he adds a statement, with the rod they will smite the judge, probably a reference to the leader of Israel, maybe even a king. So it seems like, again, with that word now, and the fact that it seems like another event where people of Judah suffer, that they've been laid siege against, and a leader of Israel, perhaps a king, has been judged. Now, this one's very difficult to know exactly what he's talking about. I think it's clear he's shifting time again. It's probably, again, I stress probably, I believe this is a reference to when a king of Israel is smitten. If you remember Zedekiah during the Babylonian siege, he was captured and his eyes were gouged out. This might be referring to that. I believe it's speaking of, again, back to the Babylonian exile. Because remember, Babylonian exile, there were 3 sieges. Okay? Yeah. There were 3 waves. So I think this is another wave where Micah, again, is bringing up another time where the people of Judah were in distress. Okay? So I can't be certain, but I am confident it's a change in time to another time in their history. Again, probably the Babylonian exile, because that seems to be, he's already referenced it in chapter 3. He referenced it in chapter 4. That seems to be sort of a time period he's going. That was a major time of devastation for the people of Judah. So I think that's what he's likely speaking of. And then we come to those famous verses quoted in Matthew, Micah 5:2, and we'll let our brother Entz have the honors of reading these two verses.
But as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be a ruler in Israel. His going forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel.
Okay, so what time period is this talking about? Entz, since you read it.
The birth of Christ?
Yes. The birth of Christ, or the birth of the Messiah, right? The incarnation, which is about 700 years in the future from Micah's time. Right? And then verse 4, and he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name, and they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. I think he's jumped ahead again to the Messianic kingdom, because that certainly didn't happen at the incarnation, did it? He is not great to the ends of the earth. I mean, in the one sense, he is, as far as now he's dwelling within in his people and the church, and the church is expanding and such. But as far as when it comes to the earth itself and the nations of the earth, his name is not great, but it will be. All right. So notice here, let's just summarize what's going on, right? Because Micah, I should probably just throw in here chapter 3. All right, so it seems to be a Babylonian exile. 100. That is a time when Jerusalem is in ruins and in judgment. Could be a reference to future time as well, just before Armageddon, when nations come against her. But notice after chapter 3, when he speaks of Jerusalem's destruction, you've got far future, Messianic kingdom. Then he comes back to the Babylonian exile. Then he goes back to the beginning of the Messianic kingdom. Then he comes back to the Babylonian exile. Then he goes forward, this time to the incarnation. And then from there, he goes forward again to the Messianic kingdom. All within less than 20 verses. All right? So, I mean, stop and think about this for a minute. This is clearly future events, right? So if we were to say, what's the time frame of chapters 4, these verses from 4:1 to 5:4, we would say future, relative to Micah's time. But they're different times in the future. And it's not even sequential. He doesn't start with like Babylonian exile and then go to incarnation and then go to, before Armageddon, then go to the Messianic kingdom. Right? He goes back and forth. Messianic kingdom, Babylonian exile, beginning of the Messianic kingdom, Babylonian exile, incarnation, Messianic kingdom. So here we can see why the Jews, before the incarnation were very confused, right? They just assumed, because I don't know that they would have necessarily figured out that these are all different events. We have the luxury of looking back. And with the incarnation and the Babylonian exile, okay, these we know when these happened. They're in our past. They weren't in Micah's past. They were at least 100 years and more in the future. And again, Babylon wasn't even it was a region, but it wasn't a power to be feared at that point in time. And so we have to first take note of this. And I think this is an excellent case for just being careful about taking prophecies out and trying to understand their events and come up with some eschatological sequence of events and for our end times understanding, right? This passage just would mess up your chronology charts bad. Because, especially like I said, if you were, a Jewish scholar before before the days of Christ, or trying to understand this in Micah's day, there'd be no way they could figure all this out as far as timing, or even just recognizing there were far and near future events all mixed together. 100 years, thousands of years, 700 years, 100 years, thousands of years. So this begs the question, why? What is Micah doing? Why does he take just a few verses and jump to one point in time and then go back and then forward and back and then partially forward? Why does he do that? You guys have any thoughts about that? I know we haven't studied Micah, but just what are your observations maybe from that, or things that come to your mind just considering this passage?
Pastor, just
could it be that
thinking.
he was?
Oh,
Go ahead, Dad. Go ahead, Dad.
I see. Pastor is just following what you said a while ago, that we can think of them like parables and placing them in the flow of thought of the author, and then getting the fact that during that time when this was written, they don't have the luxury that we have of looking back. So they might not have really known what kinds of specific events these were. Then I guess I'm just trying to guess that Micah was using these specific events to either show something about God or minister to those he was writing to, using what is pictured in these future events.
Excellent. You're thinking contextually. That's good, because that's good. Anyone else have some thought? We'll come back to that, Tabs, but
Okay, Pastor.
yeah, you're on the right track for sure. Robbie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was about to say that Micah was used here by God to warn the people of Israel, to rebuke them. But in the midst,
Uh-oh. I think Robbie was going to speak some heresy there, so God just cut him off. Better change your point.
anyway, I was just gonna say that Micah was called by God to give a message to his of Israel, to rebuke them primarily for the way that they were living as a people of God. But in the midst of the rebuking um, and the warnings of a judgment that was now about to come on them, point them to future blessing. In a way, reminding them that though they had been, although they have been, am I still there? Can you still hear me? Yeah. Although they were um, going to be judged and the judgment would be severe, God would still be fulfilling his covenant promises to them in the future. So the interchange between um, the the judgment messages and the future blessing messages may have been for that purpose. So in the midst of the heavy rebuking and warning, Micah was also trying to encourage them regarding what God would fulfill for them in the future.
Yeah, he seems to be moving from a judgment oracle in chapter 3 to a salvation oracle in chapter 4. Um, here, for that's good. I mean, again, think about, guys, let's go back to the text here, the context, just like both Robbie and Tabs had mentioned, right? He's speaking of um, right, those who have built Zion with bloodshed, Jerusalem with violence, and then they keep saying, you know, Yahweh's with us, evil won't come upon us, and then God said, well, nope, it's going to happen. And the implication that, you know, they're saying, isn't Yahweh in our midst? Isn't he's with us, so evil can't happen. But actually, so the implication is um, judgment will happen. Therefore, God is not going to be in their midst. He's going to allow this destruction to take place. Okay. And then in Micah 4, Micah presents a series of events at different times where God shows that he will, again in the future, be with them and deliver them from times of distress. Right? That's after he basically, chapter 1 or verses 1 to 8 are, you know, sort of they'll be delivered from the distress of chapter 3, you know, the Messianic kingdom. Then in chapter 9, he describes his time of Babylonian exile when they're going to be taken out of the city and go to Babylon. And then notice he says in verse that Yahweh would redeem them from the hand of their enemies. So he speaks of a time they'll be delivered. This will be from Babylon, right? Then when we get to verses, what is it, 11 to 13, he describes another time. This is Armageddon, when the nations have assembled against Judah. But it describes how God will deliver them. And then he goes to another time where they've been laid siege against. Again, probably Babylon, we're not sure. But then Micah brings up future time they'll be delivered, this time with the incarnation. So there seems to be these particular descriptions of times in Israel's future when they will be under distress and God will deliver them. He won't abandon them, which makes sense because just in chapter 3, he said there's going to be a time in the future God will abandon them in judgment. But that's not going to be the way it is forever. Because let me tell you, here's one time where, you know, and he talks about the Messianic kingdom, everything, there won't be any more violence against you. Then there'll be a time where there will be violence against you and God will deliver you. And then there's another time that there'll be, the nations will gather against you, but Yahweh will deliver you. And here's another time when you'll be, you know, so I think for one thing, what he's doing is just describing, telling of future events where, yes, in the future you will face judgment and Jerusalem will be in ruins and I will not be with you, but be encouraged. That's not going to be the end. Let me tell you of a few situations in the future, far or near future. Doesn't matter to Micah, right? His point is there will be times where you will be under distress, but God will deliver you. Okay? So I think that's one thing going on here is if we just read this in the flow of the context, as Tabs mentioned at the beginning, and understanding, okay, what is it from each of these events that seems to be what Micah's pointing out? And I think it is that God's delivering them. Each of those events, God's delivering them. He presents a future attack, God delivers. 3 times he does that here. And they're different events, different time periods. One's the Messianic kingdom, the other's the Babylonian exile, the other he's describing when when the Messiah comes. Now, what's interesting about that one, when he's predicting the birth of the Messiah, is I think, again, there's a gap here in time between verse 1 and verse 2. The other deliverances he describes in chapter 4, there's an immediate deliverance, right? Armageddon, the nations gather, Christ comes, they're delivered. Babylon exile, they are put in exile, and okay, it's 70 years, but in the big picture, that's not a long time. That's not hundreds of years. They're delivered. But here, between the events of verse 1 and verse 2 is about 600 or 700 years. Now, I don't know if that's intentional. It's just something that I noticed. So there's something I think unique in this third example. Right? And what is unique about this third example compared to the other, the 5 other time references in this section of Micah? What's unique about verse 2 and 3? Am I asking the obvious? Right? Here's where the Messiah is born.
This is a messianic fulfillment.
Yes. When he arrives. The first 8 verses, it's the Messianic kingdom, so he's already there. Verse 4 is again during the Messianic kingdom. Armageddon is Messianic kingdom. There it just describes, Yahweh will deliver them. But here in 5, 2, and 3, he speaks specifically of one will go forth for me. So here Yahweh is speaking to be ruler in Israel. All right. So he's speaking here specifically of when this Messiah is born. So I think there's something else going on here in these verses. I think one, Micah's presenting examples of when people of God will be in distress and God will deliver them. So he gives, a few examples of that here, going back and forth in time. All right. He doesn't care about chronology. He's not concerned about, the order of the events. All he's concerned about is the events themselves and that they are times of Israel's distress and God's deliverance. In contrast to chapter 3, when Jerusalem was facing judgment and God wasn't with them. You guys following me?
Yeah.
But then I think there's something else going on in these verses. And I think verses 2 and 3 sort of highlight this arrival of the king. But there's something interesting that Micah says when he talks about when the people are in the Babylonian exile. When he moves from that messianic kingdom, the bliss of the messianic kingdom, and then verse 9, sort of that abrupt, why do you make a loud shout? is there no king among you? I think that there's something going on here with that question. Because what is Micah 5, 2, and 3, by the way? You guys just mentioned it. It's the arrival of a king,
Messiah.
right? The ruler in Israel, the king, right? The Messiah, the one who will reign in Zion in verses 1 to 8, the one who will bring the deliverance in verses 11 to 13 from Armageddon. Is that the Armageddon? Yeah. And I think that question, I believe, Micah throws in there, not just as a poetic, reference to a time when they're in trouble and the kings have been taken, which is certainly what happened in the Babylonian exile, right? They were no longer under a king of Israel. They were taken away and were under Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But I think it's really bringing up an important aspect here, that who is it ultimately that would be the king? Who is it ultimately that will bring these deliverances for them? Who is it ultimately that will bring the kingdom, God's peace upon the earth, right? Before God's kingdom can come, there needs to be a king, right?
Yeah.
So I think Micah's question, is there no king among you, sort of hangs in the air to me as I go through this whole passage. That's an interesting question, because it's interesting because of what he does at the end when he does describe the coming of a king. And so I think Micah's presenting these events. Yeah, there's going to be times in the future that it's going to be distress upon you. And yes, God will deliver you, but then there'll be another distress, and God will deliver you, be another distress. But there's good news. Your king is coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, Robbie.
I think this also, Micah 5, 2, and 3 also is so timed, as you had mentioned with regard to Micah 4 and 9. That in Micah 4 and 9, they had their last king and would not have another king ever until the coming of the Messiah, who would be the final king. And maybe the timing of the prophecy in Micah 5, 2, and 3 um, signals to us in comparison to the prophecy, future prophecies in chapter 4. It's like saying this has to happen first before all the other prophecies in chapter 4, all the prophecies of blessing and deliverance in chapter 4 has to happen. This, and that's why the proximity of the prophecy regarding the coming of Christ here, um, to the prophecies in chapter 4 is more, is sooner rather, is nearer in the future than the prophecies in chapter 4. So it's like Michael was saying, this is what will need to happen first, the coming of your king, because it will be him uh, who will be fulfilling, or through whom God will fulfill the future prophecies in chapter 4.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good insight. It makes sense why he would only speak of the Babylonian exile, because that was the time where the last Israel king reigned. Right? There was appointed kings, and then there were a governor, right? Nehemiah was Zerubbabel was a governor. Nehemiah was a governor, but there was never again a king. Herod was a king, but he wasn't appointed. He was appointed by the Romans. So Israel's not had a king since the days of Babylon. So it makes sense, right, that the two major events when the king of Israel would appear would be the incarnation and messianic kingdom. So Micah only speaks here really of three time periods, doesn't he? Babylonian exile, the incarnation, messianic kingdom. The days of Israel's last king, the days when the, the next true king is born, and the days when he returns. Kind of interesting. And I think he, the more I look at this passage, the more I see just, the amazing complexity. And at the same time, it's really, I think, carefully designed to draw emphasis to two things. One, that God will ultimately be a deliverer for his people. And here are some examples. Yes, you will face judgment, but there will be deliverance. And secondly, and more importantly, I think the focus on the deliverer. And so it makes sense to me that you look at these three time periods, which have specific importance in regards to the king of Israel. The days when the last king reigned, the day when the ultimate king is born, and then the day when he returns. And then connecting that then with the idea of, that God will be a deliverer of his people. So I think we have a very, intricately woven passage here as far as what Micah's trying to do. Does that make sense, you guys? I mean, do you see? I don't know. I don't mean to be confusing. And I think this passage is confusing until you really try to understand, how Micah's making connections here. And why these events? Why in this mixed up order? And how does it relate to chapter 3? And then we want to look forward into chapter 6, rest of Micah 5 and then 6 to see, okay, how do those connect? But thoughts or questions about that, or comments yourselves?
Yes, Pastor Tim. Just a thought that passages like this, I think it rules out the view that Israel has no plan in the future of God because they have forfeited their right. Because here, God is prophesying their judgment, but at the same time, He's also He is also prophesying in the far future their deliverance, their coming King, and His rule over them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Otherwise, boy, if you think it's confusing, even, having the perspective there's a future for Israel, imagine how confusing it is to interpret this if you don't believe that. Like, what is going on here? Right? I think I'm curious, how this will be interpreted by our Amiel buddies.
Yeah. Or yeah. I also wanted to ask that how does someone with who believes in covenant theology and the promises to Israel are now transferred to the church, I wonder how they would handle a book like Micah.
Yeah, I don't think I'd have to look and see if I don't know if I have any covenantal guys on this on Micah. I think I might. It's been a while since I studied this passage. Well, it is like Zechariah 14. I think I've told you guys before, because Zechariah 14 speaks of Yahweh's feet resting on the Mount of Olives, And again, the nations gathered, and Yahweh, right? Jerusalem will be ravaged, but then Yahweh will will defeat the enemies, and then he'll reign from Jerusalem. The nations will come to Jerusalem, and but some of the nations will be judged if they don't worship the Yahweh at Jerusalem. So, they don't really know what to do with that one either. And I don't know, did I mention to you guys what Martin Luther did the first time he tried to interpret that when he did a commentary on Zechariah? Did I tell you? Uh, if I did,
No.
Manny would remember, but he's not here. So, um, yeah, Martin Luther in the first edition of his commentary, he said, I don't know how he worded it, but something to the effect of I can give no interpretation here. I have no idea what the prophet is saying. He didn't give a commentary. He gave up because at that time, Luther had an amillennial point of view, as did pretty much all Catholics and former Catholics of that day. So he had no idea how to interpret it. I think later, when he came back to Zechariah later in life and did put together something in the commentary when he had a little more uh, thought about it. But at the beginning, he had no idea. It's like, and that's, for me, I look at these passages and there's so many of them. Micah 4 and 5, just one other example where there's clearly, he's speaking to the people of Judah. He's speaking to his people. They're the pronoun you, and he's telling them, Jerusalem, he mentioned specific place, Zion, Babylon. I mean, all of this, there's specific geographic references. And so to not take it literally, it's like, okay, what do you do with all that? How are you going to interpret this? You really have to, abandon a lot of basic principles of interpretation, I think, in order to get around passages like this. And then even too, just the integrity of the author and the integrity of the Lord, as he's speaking these messages, he's promising future deliverance for his people. And, if it's not them, if it's the people of God, not the Jews, then, boy, the original audience would not have taken it that way. They would be saying, Micah's talking to us. And he was talking to them. But if you say, no, 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 Israel's done, then, I think there's an integrity issue here. Micah for sure. And then obviously the Holy Spirit who is, breathing, in the inerrancy into the passage, right? That he's the other author here. So
which continues to baffle me, Tim, because we know of many um, faithful uh, preachers who preach expositorily, but when it comes to this part, it seems that their theological leanings overtake the hermeneutical principles um, in exposition, and it baffles me how that could happen.
yeah, I'm just looking for a book. There's a helpful book. I think I've mentioned it to you guys before. See if I can find it by Michael Block.
Oh, yeah.
It's on supersessionism.
Mm.
Um, I thought I had it right here. I was just going to show you guys just so you could. Oh, it's the. It must be. Come on. Where'd it go? Because I don't remember the title directly. Oh, that's weird. But yeah, it's Michael
Is
Vlock.
it?
Something like
Is it? Is it? Has the church replaced Israel?
yeah, that's it. That's a good one to get, guys. Um,
Yeah.
really helpful. It's not very thick, and he just really sort of deals with a few key issues on this particular topic that I think you would find very helpful. I don't know, Tabs, if you'll have it assigned to you in seminary for eschatology class, but very helpful book. I would say two of the most helpful books to me, sort of related to this issue and interpreting, um, how to interpret Old Testament passages. And, one is Vlock's book. Um, what was the title again? Israel. Is there a future for Israel? Is that what you said, Robbie?
Yeah. Has the church replaced Israel?
That's gonna bug me. It should be right here. I'm sure I'll find it right when we leave. We
I
finish.
remember you also mentioned another of Locke's books. He will reign forever.
Yeah, that's a good
Biblical
overview.
theology of the kingdom of God.
Yeah, the kingdom of God. It's a good overview of scripture and this theme of the kingdom of God. Certainly the messianic kingdom would be the key element of that. He's writing another one or just published another one um, on dispensationalism, like the hermeneutics of dispensationalism. I haven't read it yet, but um, uh, looking forward to getting that. And then the other book that's very helpful is Abner's book, um, Abner Chow on the
Yeah.
that one I do remember. That biblical writers, hermeneutics of the biblical writers. I think I mentioned this one to you guys before. Um, helpful one. Just and this goes actually to the next topic I wanted to cover with you guys. It's related to it, and that is, um, the last step in the prophetic analysis. But before we get there, I just want to emphasize, as you're studying a prophetic passage, and you get to the sixth step is really understand, you have to understand how does this, let's say you're studying, Micah 5, 1 and 2. You can't dissect that. You cannot pull that out and just make it all about the incarnation. Certainly that's what it's talking about. Certainly it's evidence of fulfilled prophecy, and it's an encouragement to our faith, right? Here's a prophecy given, we know, hundreds of years before Christ is born, and it tells us where he's going to be born. And even the Jews in at Jesus' birth, right? They knew they told Herod, oh yeah, where's he going to be born? He's going to be born right here. So they understood that from the so certainly this isn't, if you're preaching Micah 5, 2, and 3, certainly there's emphasis there, but don't miss how it fits into the context.
Right.
If you can't explain, okay, why are those two verses there? He's not just telling the future. That's not his main point. He certainly, he is speaking of future events, certainly. But he's not like sitting there going, okay, I'm going to, just give out these future events and explain what's going on, give you people a chronology. He's not even talking to us directly, right? He's talking to the people of Judah in his day who were unfaithful to the covenant, who were being unjust, who were being oppressive and abusive. And he's saying, look, this is a problem. God's gonna bring consequences for your injustice. It's gonna happen. He's gonna abandon you. And I think there would be some going, oh, is that it? Is this it? Is he gonna abandon us forever? And God says, no, 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 no. Let me remind you, there will be times in your future that you will be in distress and trouble. I will deliver you. Ultimately, that deliverance will come through the future king. So he is the answer to Israel's problem that they will lose their king. There will be no king among them. And there will be, but he will fulfill the promise of bringing that future ultimate king of David. And of course, we know that. So I think Micah's is a great example of, one, just seeing how future events are used by the prophets. And it's not always some chronological sequence so that we can figure out, what thing's going to happen when. But that they're used, thematically, they're used to support and connect to the message that he's bringing to the people of his day. So very important point that we need to understand. I just like Micah for, one, because of this interesting dynamic of, back and forth, Micah's time machine was certainly broken, right? He kept showing up in different times, but then also how he weaves those different times into the message that he wants to deliver to the people. All right. And so any last thoughts or questions on that before we look at just briefly look at the last step in the prophetic analysis?
Pastor, just wanted to ask. So for example, we saw what Micah was using the prophetic um, pictures for. In preaching it, what are the parameters that we need to be reminded of so that we don't go off on just following? Because it's very interesting and the details are very very intriguing to follow. So when you're preaching it, what are the parameters wherein we can still share that it's a future event without digressing totally from what Micah wanted to present as his message?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. How would you preach this particular passage? I'm just digging up. I wanted to see what I did with this back in the old days when I preached this message. Let's see. It looks like
Tim,
yeah,
I
go ahead.
think Tab's question is so relevant because there might be a tendency to begin to interpret each and every prophecy um, in detail. So I think his question is so valid because we can just go off into to each and every prophecy and take so much time there. And then lose the whole flow. of the book. I think, is that what you were asking, Tabs?
Yes,
Something
yes,
similar
Pastor.
to that.
Yeah, that's what kind of what I wanted to ask, and I was just wondering, how do we, in cases, in passages like these, like how do we make that bridge
Mm.
from that time crossing into where we are right now? Because we though we have the luxury of looking back, sometimes the luxury of looking back becomes a
Mm.
disadvantage when you preach, because you have so much to look back on or something like that.
Mm.
Yeah, like you can get caught up in the details of, like Micah 5:1, you could spend half an hour talking about the different views of who the judge of Israel is and what does it mean that he gouged his eyes out and what is this referred to in time, when is this? And that is the temptation, is to just dig
Mm.
into the it's kind of like that in narratives, right? Where we can it's
Mhm.
easy to get caught up in rabbit trails and side trails, which can be interesting, could provide useful thoughts, but I think our first and primary mission is to identify what his point is. And I don't think Micah's point was sharing with us all the details of each of these future events in order so that we could figure out when they're going to happen. I think he only gives us certain details of these events as it relates to the message he's trying to communicate, which is God is their deliverer. There will be times of distress when God will deliver them, and we need to ultimately to the Messiah to be that deliverer.
Yeah.
And so, in my mind, I was just looking at when I preached this. I mean, I preached similar to kind of how we approached it tonight, where it just sort of gave us overview summary of those verses. I didn't spend a bunch of time looking at all the different views and all this and that. It's just like, okay, here he's talking about, it looks like it's probably, this is referring to the Messianic kingdom, but what's going on here? They're in trouble. Yahweh delivers them. Okay, let's look at this event. They're in trouble. Yahweh delivers them. This event, Yahweh, they're in trouble. Yahweh, well, how does this relate to what he said before? So I just kind of this whole discussion I had in the sermon, though I tried to make it a little more,
Mm.
you know, uh, flow a little better. But then, yeah, the all of this points to is really focusing on, I think that key question is there no king among you? And then,
Mm.
but as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, one will go forth for you from me, who will be ruler in Israel. And then for us, it's that message was fulfilled. Now we can look back at that and see, wow, one piece of this actually is fulfilled. The king has come. And then you could take him to
Mm.
Matthew
Mhm.
2, right? Obviously, this is a fulfillment. What does this tell us? You know, one, God fulfills his promises, and here we have an example of that. But two, that the Messiah has come, and therefore he will come again and fulfill all of these other prophecies of delivering Israel. But ultimately, he has kept his promise to deliver us, right? The Abrahamic covenant. All the nations will be blessed through Abraham. Here we see in the Messiah the fulfillment of that promise thousands of years ago. And we're a part of that. And there's your segue to the gospel.
Mm. Mhm.
So, much of the time you're going to be rooted in trying to explain, what's going on here and how it connects to, what Micah's saying. So you are going to spend a lot of time doing that just because this is a complex passage. But you want them to see, I'm not getting into all the details of these events, except to just sort of recognize generally the period of time he's talking about. I want to focus on what he brings up from those events, and then together, okay, what's the big picture here of this section of Micah? He's pointing to the king who will be their deliverer. And then now, okay, hopefully that makes sense. What's the connection to us today? Well, there we have an incredibly direct connection, because it's pointing to the Messiah, of course. And part one has happened. We're waiting for part two. So there's a lot of ways you could go with that as far as application, right? Just assurance of God's faithfulness, the majesty of the Messiah, that God sent the deliverer, what we have to look forward to in the future, the Messianic King. I mean, there's a lot of things you could focus on as an application from that point. But so that's sort of the basic pattern I see, as you go through prophecy. Understand the message in its context. The message. All right. Notice I didn't say figure out all the prophetic events in detail. Focus first on the message of those prophetic events and how it relates to what the prophet's saying. And then make the connection to us, say, what timeless truths undergird or support that message. Here the message would be, the coming of the king who would be that deliverer of God's people. And then, okay, what's the connection then? What's the timeless truth or the foundation of that? Well, that's a direct connection to us because that deliverer is our deliverer. Now, Gentiles aren't in that passage. They're not in Micah, as far as I can see. I mean, it mentions nations, but usually the nations there are the ones gathered against. But he does mention, I believe, a couple of places where the nations are part of who will experience the blessings of the Messianic kingdom. So you could draw upon those statements. I'd have to go back and look from what was read here.
Micah 4:2.
4:2. Yes, there it is. There it is. Okay. So here we talk about Gentile peoples, right? Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, now I remember, right? The peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come. All right, so yeah, we see, and then I think later, they're mentioned as well. Here the nations are assembled against them, but yeah, that time it would be great to the ends of the earth. Okay, so oh, am I even sharing this with you guys? Sorry about that. But yeah, here in verses chapter 4, as this is speaking of meaning the Gentiles render decisions for distant nations. Nation will not lift up sword against nation. So yeah, it's talking about our experience in the Messianic kingdom. So yeah, it's okay. What is the message? What do you need to understand first the prophet's message to his hearers, and then how that prophecy or prophecies in this case, multiple future events relate to that message. How do they communicate that message? And then you're looking for those timeless truths that are the foundation of that message and how the prophet applies it and how does that connect to us. And in this case, their Messiah is our Messiah. Ephesians 2, right, talks about we didn't have the messianic promises, but now we have been brought in through the Messiah to those promises. We don't replace them, but we definitely are receiving, obviously, the benefits of this Messiah. And then, yeah, there's some specific blessings mentioned in Micah 4 regarding nations during the Messiah's reign. And just as it was, I believe Micah 4 was intended to be an encouragement to the remnant in Micah's day, so too it's an encouragement to us,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
So, and then really the last step, and I guess we'll just have to, we could talk more about it. I think it'd be better to wait till next time to discuss. Is the passage cited or alluded to anywhere in the New Testament, else in the Scripture? So the idea of fulfillment, and understanding, is this prophecy happened? And in Micah's case, some parts of it has. And we can point like Micah 5, 2, and 3 is an obvious one, right? Because that one's quoted in Matthew. So we'll talk more about that, I think, next time, since it's getting close to noon here. But this is the challenge with these prophetic books, and one that I found very difficult. I found it much harder. To me, it was much harder to know how does the text connect to my congregation than it was trying to figure out the message of the prophet. Honestly, I know. So I have a great appreciation for, I know the early church fathers, they really blew it when they went down the allegorical path, but I understand why, because it's hard to know, okay, how does this apply to the church? I think Micah here is relatively straightforward because of the obvious reference to the Messiah and the fulfillment of the incarnation in Matthew 2. But, many of the other ones, it's a lot harder to, what do you do with, Joel and some of these other ones? Talk about a future locust plague coming if the people of Israel don't repent. And it's like, well, okay, I don't think that's the same promise to the church that if we don't repent, he's going to bring locusts on the church, Um, the audience is different, right? The people in Joel were mostly unbelieving Jews, not following the Mosaic covenant. That's not your congregation, I assume, right? Your congregation's not full of unbelieving Jews, is it, that aren't following the Mosaic covenant? So we have not only a different time and place and culture, we have a very different audience from these guys. You can say something, Robbie?
No, no. There's a similar challenge also when you're dealing with with portions of Old Testament narratives in terms of tying that up. How how does this somehow speak to your congregation?
Oh yeah.
So, and you have to be careful not to bring out principles that are not there
That's
um,
hard.
in the narrative. It's hard.
That is hard. I was just having that discussion with some guys earlier this week, about with narratives, and the temptation to moralize and to look for these uh, finer, finer, more subtle things in the narratives, which really weren't something the author was pointing out, but we sort of make a whole sermon out of, and we got to be careful. Certainly, there are examples, and illustrations of, but is that the main point the author's trying to make? And I would have the same question with these prophetic texts. Is the prophecy the main thing? like the actual events themselves and understanding the details, and sometimes it is. Sometimes there are, like in Daniel 9:24-27, when he lays out a specific sequence of events, as he's describing. But oftentimes it's simply there's something about those events that is important to the prophet's message and what he's trying to get at. Difficult stuff. Difficult to study and also difficult to preach. And I think that's why, most of us just avoid them. I probably should have when I first preached through the prophets. I made a lot of mistakes. But yeah, they're definitely a challenge. All right. Any final thoughts, guys? It's good to see Jason didn't crash. He's still alive. So that's good. Well, thanks. Hopefully that was helpful. And like I said, we'll plan to gather next week. I will be gone in March. I'm going to Shepherd's Conference and then Pakistan for a couple weeks. So I think we'll have probably a 3-week break during March. So the first week of March and the last week, I'll be able to meet. So the 2nd and the 30th, but those 3 weeks in between won't be available.
Okay.
Okay, but I am available next week, so let's plan to gather. Or actually, next week is the 1st,
Yeah.
isn't it? 2nd, I mean.
The second.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll get together, Lord willing, next week, and then take a few weeks off, come back together the 30th. All right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. The schedule's great. I won't have to be absent.
All right.
I'll see you soon, Pastor.
Okay. Yes, you will, Lord willing. Are you going to TMEI, the symposium?
Yes, Pastor, I will. I volunteered, Pastor, to help out.
Oh, great. Okay.
I don't know where they're gonna stick me, but I don't know where they're gonna put me, but I'll be there. I
Okay.
volunteered.
Yeah, let's connect when I'm there.
Okay.
Let me ask Ent if you could close us in prayer.